So a story of miraculous provision of bread. Incredible bread provided by God. I have some miraculous bread provided by God with me. I do. There you go. I think it's no less miraculous that we get this stuff. I can't bake. I don't own any fields. But what we have basically done is let some grass get really big and old and dry, and then smash it up and mix it with water and fungus, and then you stick it in an oven, and you don't even properly cook it. These are incredible ones. Then I get to finish cooking it at home, and my house smells like fresh bread. Now, that's mad, that's what we can do with grass and yeast and water. It is no less miraculous, I suggest, than the story we heard from Exodus today, that we still get to do bread of this sort. It's no less miraculous, and it's so special that we still meet on Sunday mornings and gather around bread. It's part of our story. Let's remember that God didn't just create once, that there wasn't just one miracle, that we get to do anything at all, that we continue to exist, and our part of his unfolding story is still a miracle. Our theme today is that there is enough. There's enough for everyone every day. More than enough. We'll look at what that means and why. We're going to think about this passage, do a bit of exegesis, that word that means get the meaning out of the passage, and then ask, so what? The action takes place in that Exodus story exactly a month after they'd left Egypt. So they've been ticking along very nicely with the stuff they brought with them. They're well prepared, take some food, and then it runs out, as it does. They're now in the desert, they're the far side of the Red Sea, and they have run out of food, and they are scared and complaining and grumbling. And I would go easy on them. I have rarely run out of food, and if I have, I can normally get some food. It's not that hard. I'm quite lucky, I guess. Sometimes we run out of stuff, and it's a real problem like this. I was reading the story of, his name was Captain Robert Pichet. He's an Air Transat pilot. He holds a world record for the longest unpowered flight. He ran out of fuel in his passenger airplane 70 miles from the Azores, having taken off from Toronto. That must have been frightening, right? You're a few miles up in the sky and 70 miles from land. He went 70 miles with no fuel, gliding a thing not made to be a glider, landed safely. He's in the record books. But that must have been frightening. That's the sort of running out of getting to the end of the resources you thought you had that the Israelites are facing at this point. When they moan, as they do here and in lots of the coming up passages, we should go easy on them. It's okay, it makes sense that they're moaning and afraid. And it takes a long time. We look at it and go, the Lord has just brought you out. Surely you're fine. But they have been suffering basically abuse and oppression for generations. It takes a long time to unlearn that and learn to trust. To go from a place where their daily amount was this mean allotted, you only get this every day, to instead their daily amount being have everything you need every day. It takes them 40 years to learn that. They complain and grumble and moan, and then Moses doesn't even get to pray to God. Moses doesn't need to intervene or intercede. They complain, if you remember, and then God says, right, here's the plan. I'm going to give you bread in the morning and quail, meat in the evening. They complain, God hears their complaint, and God acts. He hears, he knows, and he responds. I think that is still true in perhaps different ways. And there is enough for everyone. Everyone gathered what they needed. The people who gathered a lot, turns out they had enough. The people who gathered not so much, turns out they had enough. And I just wanted to point out, as we're looking at this, three interesting approaches to miracles. We've had the first miracle that occurred as they were leaving was this crossing the Reed Sea. And that one gets explained. They're trying to cross it, and then overnight the Lord blows this strong wind which dries up a path through the middle and they can cross it. It happens because of weather, and the Lord explains that. Then we get a miracle, I think it's next week, Sue's going to talk about this, where they run out of water, and God says to Moses, hit the rock, and I will do a thing, and they get water, and people are like, oh, okay, this happens when Moses does this. There's something going on, it's a bit weird. This happens, though, the manna, the bread that appears magically. Do you know what manna means? We didn't hear the term. Well, we did. It's the sentence, what is it? Manna is Hebrew for, what is it? It's one of those words that then gets applied to things like kangaroo. When the first first English people got to Australia, they pointed at the kangaroo. What's that over there? And the Australian said, kangaroo, which I think is native for, oh dear, white people are here. It should have been. It's one of those words that we've borrowed, and it means, what is it? And it doesn't get explained. It never gets explained. And they just have to trust that there is mystery in the way God does this stuff. They have to lean on God without an explanation. For other things, they did get an explanation. I thought that was interesting. But they get this provision, and it's food. They get bread, and they get quail. God's provision often looks like food when it's working. At its best, food is God's love made nutritious and delicious. It's why we still meet around a meal. God, of course, doesn't just give them food. He says it's a test. He says, you need to make sure you gather enough for today. Don't keep it for tomorrow. I'll give you more tomorrow when you need it. Trust me. And they mostly do that, but some of them do not. They fail that test. It turns into maggots and smells awful and has to be thrown out. Is God angry with this? No, he is not. Isn't that interesting? God is not at all. He said, I'm going to set you this test. Some of them fail miserably, and then God just provides more the next day. Moses is angry. Moses gets really cross. Maybe there's something for church leaders to know that some of the things we are cross about, God is not cross about. I thought that was really interesting. God says this is a test, and yet failing it has no consequences for people. He just continues to provide. He doesn't demand that they trust him. He says, I expect that you can trust me, and continues to do things which make him trustworthy. That's how trust works. There are people in your lives that you trust. They didn't demand that you trust them. They earned that trust. That's how it works. There's grace in this, in being allowed to fail with God. It did make me wonder, it's kind of off to one side, I don't have a point about this, but what about those kids who grew up with this happening every day, who just learned that God miraculously did this stuff every day? That must be really hard to learn that that's miraculous. And then, of course, those kids got to the promised land and it didn't happen and they had to start farming. That must have been hard. Next time this comes around in the lectionary, we'll talk about that. I thought it was interesting. And then we get, there's a bit after what Fiona read, and I didn't ask her to read it because it was a long enough reading, and thank you very much, Fiona. But the next bit is God says, of course, on Fridays, pick up twice as much. Tomorrow's the Sabbath. You won't need to go collecting. Trust me, that'll be fine. And they have to trust him again that there's enough for 2 days, and there's enough that they get to take rest, that it's going to be okay. You don't have to keep working. God will give you enough to have a rest. It's really important. And interesting that that comes up before we've got to the Ten Commandments, before they've been told about Sabbath. It's another clue that this was written years later, where the people who were reading this knew that Sabbath was a thing. We'll come to that in a second. So I think that's enough of that's the story unpacked. Those are the bits that I want to draw out for it. So what? So what? What's the story? How can I stand here and tell you there is enough? That God still miraculously provides enough when he doesn't and there isn't. There's a big food bank basket at the back, and miraculously, food banks are getting 27% more donations this year than they were last year. But the requirement has gone up by 40%. There is not enough. And we're having to provide stuff for people to wash. They want laundry soap and clothes washing stuff and toothbrushes and sanitary products and razors because there isn't enough. How do I stand here and tell you there's enough when there isn't? How do I stand here and tell you there's enough when, there's enough land to go around in Israel-Palestine, and yet there isn't. And there's a problem, and we are tearing ourselves apart there on the very ground that Jesus walked. And there isn't enough justice, and there isn't enough safety, and there isn't enough... there is, but there isn't. We have engineered a world in which there isn't enough. There are people in prison, and prisons are so full we're going to have to stop sending people to prison at the moment. There isn't enough of that. And when you get there, it's awful. How do I tell you that there is enough? How are chaplains in prisons preaching that? How are those who know they grow up in places where things that are not their fault mean that they do not have enough because of their race or their gender or their level of poverty or whatever? There is not enough. How can I stand here in church where there are churches where there isn't enough, where we know what we do and it's here for everybody and we do what we can and there's gluten-free wafers and things like that, but there are people who don't go to church and can't go to church and are excluded, and there isn't enough even here where it's supposed to be the kingdom of God. There isn't enough. What's interesting is that this isn't some pie-in-the-sky story, like, oh, there was enough, oh, now there isn't. The people who wrote this, they didn't write it down as they were going along. This story, Exodus, was written hundreds of years later, in or just after the exile, when there was not enough, where God's people were a long way away, and the temple had been destroyed, and many of their family had been killed, and there was no land, and it wasn't working. There wasn't enough, or perhaps they'd just come back and they're trying to build the temple and it looks small and rubbish compared to what was knocked down, and the local tribes are having a go at them, and there isn't enough. They wrote this to remind themselves that the God they follow does provide enough, and yet somehow they believed the exile had happened. These consequences had happened to them because they had failed to do what they were told to do. We're getting to the laws in a couple of weeks, but the big commandment that you get throughout the Old Testament, the most popular commandment in the Bible, you might not know this, is do not fear. But the second one, you only get after that throughout the Old Testament, is be kind to the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. That's the rule, all the way through the Old Testament. If that's the only thing you learn that it says in the Old Testament, you be nice to those who are without power. And they weren't, so there was the exile. There were consequences. And it is in that lack of enough, that lack of enough that comes from injustice, from their failure to do the right thing, that they write this story of God providing enough and telling them to make sure there is enough for everybody. So I can stand here and say these things because it's not news. God's people have always known this. Enough, of course, enough and trust in God takes them years to learn. As we said, they've been oppressed and subjected to violence and slavery for years. It takes them 40 years to learn to trust God of small daily acts. Even the miracle becomes taken for granted, but building the habit means taking time apart between Egypt and the land, time apart in the desert, time just with God, small daily acts. Another bit that we get later on that Fiona didn't read to us is that they get some of this manna, this what is it, that they don't know, they understand it, but they put it in a jar and they keep it in the Ark of the Covenant as a reminder. Because your minds lie to you, and mine does. You get these bits like, it used to be brilliant. We should have stayed where we were in slavery, because at least there was stuff to eat. And there wasn't enough. They had a meagre allotment, and life was hard. But they say, no, we won't do that. We will keep this image of blessing, this picture of there being enough, and take it with us so that we've got something to be thankful for. That's why we do this at the start. It's really good. What are you thankful for? We have a jar at home, a jar of enough, a jar of moments. That when life is hard, and life is often hard, even at the vicarage, there is stuff and we say, oh, that was good. There was enough. We were blessed. It's a really good habit, and that practice of gratitude that we do here, that many of you do at home, starts with manna in a jar. It's interesting. You can't trust your memories. Have yourself some stepping stones. We still complain, don't we? They complained. Moses tells them off. Of course, God doesn't. It's fine to complain. It's good to complain. It's terrible that we have to complain, that there is injustice in the world, but it is a good thing to turn up at church and moan at God and say there is not enough. Most of the Psalms start like that. It is not good enough, and there is not enough. Where are you, Lord? Are good things to say? And God answers. He answers with bread then. He answers with bread now. There might not be enough this wonderful bake-it-yourself-later bread here. But when you see bread in the Bible, we pick up these big themes. You think, what else is bread? Perhaps you think, who else is bread? It can't be a coincidence that Jesus said, of those few things he said of himself, he said 7 things of himself. He said, I am the way, the truth, and life. I am the bread of life. And that's an image that Jewish hearers will have gone, oh, that bread, this bread that miraculously keeps coming, this bread that is just enough for every day, this bread, give us today our daily bread. That resonates in their minds. They're thinking about manna and God's provision as much as about the physical bread they're still making. Jesus claims to be that enough. Jesus is the answer. That's what they'll be doing at kids' church. Jesus is always the answer when there's a question at church, right? If Jesus is the answer, maybe we have to ask ourselves, what is the question? In a world that is hurting and where there is not enough to go around, that we have engineered injustice, somehow Jesus is the answer. The answer to all those questions of death and decay and selfishness are love and generosity and sacrifice and life and resurrection. It's how the world gets fixed, is Jesus. And we are called to do what he did. So Jesus came. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Brilliant. Oh, now there is enough, right? Jesus came, so everybody we know has enough. Well, we've covered that list, and we don't, and there isn't. We're stuck with this now and not yet. It's the complicated bit of Christian life. You have to go, I believe that there is enough. Jesus says there is enough. Jesus is enough. There isn't enough. There's the food bank. There's Gaza. There's domestic abuse. There's all of that. I don't know what we do about that not being enough. Kind of two different things, I think. If you don't have enough, if you don't have enough food on the table, if you don't have enough safety in your home, if you don't have enough roof over your head, we know about that. If you don't have enough mental health support, if there is something that is missing in your life, then just first, please come and see us, and I'm sure we can help in some way. There are ways that we can support you and point you towards places where there is enough. Most of the solutions and the incredible stories you hear of there suddenly being enough start with groups of Christians pulling together and helping each other out. We would love to be part of the solution with you if there is not enough. If there is not enough safety in your home, please come and see me. We would like to be part of that. But there's other things where we worry about what is not enough when there is enough. We just like to worry about not having enough. Do you know what I mean? Do you sometimes worry about stuff that you didn't need to worry about? I'm very lucky. I don't worry about money hardly ever. And it's not because I have enough of it. Victoria looks at me sometimes and goes, all well and good for you. But, you know, when I didn't have any money, I still didn't worry about money. I just had letters printed in red. I'm just terrible at money. I can't bring myself to worry about it. I did worry about not having any wardens. That really kept me up for a couple of days. I'm like, what are we going to do? Oh, we have team warden. We found a way. I don't know where that idea came from, but between us, we've concocted this thing that is working. I don't worry about that. And then Rachel perfectly reasonably decided she wasn't going to lead the children's work after many, many years, and I was very worried. And now Olivia is leading the children's work. And I didn't need to be worried about that. And this shouldn't have been things that worried me. These are things that I need to remember to write in my jar and keep as that bit of, there was enough, we were blessed. Keep hold of it to teach me that these things work out. So that when the other things happen, like Sally's moving on to the next job and I need an admin, and there's someone with ADHD, someone to do some admin and some thinking. He's very helpful. I need to be able to share that. There was some worry there, but I remember that there has been enough and it will be okay. Nearly always it is. There's something about writing down where there has been enough that is good for you. What else can you do? Be generous. If you're going to worry about money, and unless you are really stuck for money, and that's a genuine thing, like I said, come see us, we'll try and help. But worrying about money is often as much about trust as anything. Be really generous. If you give some of your money away, it helps you remember that there is enough. I've got spare. You teach yourself with your generosity, which is why the Church of England's policy, if you look this up, new thing for me, Church of England policy is that you give 10% of your money away, and they say 5% to your church and 5% to whichever charities you like. Have a bit of fun with it. I didn't realise that was official policy. We heard that from someone a few years ago. That's what we do. I tell you what, top tip, we give, cheeky, letting you in on something, we give 5% of our money to church, I think, about that. 4% of our money to a bunch of charities, and some left that we just keep in a fund that it's God's money that we're waiting to see what needs going. There we go. We have like a tithe pot and we can just bless people, and it's God's money that we get to spend for him. So much fun. Such a treat. I commend that to you. Give stuff away. It helps you trust that there is enough. Have your days off. Have your holidays. Have your Sabbaths whenever that is. It's not Sunday for me. I'm here working and it's a treat. But have your days off. Trusting that you can rest and stop and slow down, and making not an idol of your productivity, of your need. You must do this stuff is really good for you. Please rest. There's a reason it got written into this story early. On another note, sometimes we worry not just that there is enough, but that we are enough. I don't know what your worries are. Do you worry that you're thin enough, good-looking enough, hairy enough? I'm getting that one. The camera is positioned slightly above this level, so I'm well aware that I am not as hairy as I'd like to be. Good-looking enough, wise enough, clever enough, rich enough, smart enough, funny enough, Very important to be funny enough. You have to put those things down. You worry that you're good enough at running a church, making sure it's filled with people and paying its bills. I don't know what your worries are. At least you're mine. There are a few more of them. You have to put those down. You have to recognize them and speak them and be with other people and go, it's okay. You are enough. I am enough. God made you the way that you are, and he's delighted with you. He wants you to be a better, stronger, kinder, more generous, flourishing version of yourself. You're not finished. You're a work in progress. There is stuff that you can grow in, but you have to be someone else. You are enough. And I want this to be a place where you can belong and not fit in. To belong is to be in a place where whoever you are, that's okay, and will help you be better. Whereas fitting in is where you think, what do they need me to be? I better be like that. I don't want that. This is a journey. It takes a long time. It took the Israelites 40 years wandering around in the desert to learn to trust God to be enough. And they had to join in. They had to go out and pick up the stuff. There is stuff for you to do to learn to trust God, that there is somehow enough. As we said, sometimes there won't be, and we lean on each other. But there are no shortcuts, I read, in discipleship. Trusting God is a lifelong activity of taking yourself apart from God to desert-like places, places between things. Places of prayer and fellowship and communion and giving and loving and seeking God. There's a lot of stuff that we talk about that. Going deeper, I hope you get the notes. I hope you spend some time thinking about how you can be better at this. You are enough. It's okay, but there are ways of getting better. It takes a lifetime. And I would say this, it's not about the bread. This is an incredible story, this bit, that suddenly frosties appear on the ground every day and quail at night. I assume it's frosties. That's what it must have looked like. That's an incredible story, right? And it's like a side note almost in the book of Exodus. It's not what the book of Exodus is about. This only happens so they can get to Sinai and learn what worship is and learn the law, this set of ways to behave that will show the whole world what it means to live well. The point is not the bread. You're not blessed to be blessed. They were not blessed with this to be blessed. They were blessed with it so they could learn to be God's people and be a light in the world and bless other people. It goes through us, and they have purpose. You have purpose. We have purpose. I don't know what yours is, but there is one. There is no salvation, no entry into the kingdom of God without you having something to do, which might be stuff at church, but more likely is that you are living your life in such a way that you make atheists question their lack of faith. That is the calling. We will be called to do something here in this church, and we don't know what that is. We're starting to explore again our charities. We're asking ourselves, what should we be doing with the way we are blessed, getting ready for when some big blessing comes. I'm not sure what our fight will be as a church. We're exploring how we can help with domestic violence, with mental health. We want to stay connected to the food bank. We have to pick a fight. And if you think you know, if you have an urge or a calling, let us know. But we are all, collectively, individually, blessed to be a blessing. We are given a purpose, and in that, I hope we discover that there is somehow enough, and that we are enough. And the bread that we get to bake ourselves and lots of other things are still miracles. Amen. Amen.